Good evening, everyone. To all those who are joining us here and joining us online, I want to say thank you for joining us tonight, and we hope that you enjoy the presentation. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Drew Stewart, and I am the Faith Formation Director at Saints Peter and Paul. And it is my honor and my privilege to introduce our speaker for tonight. Our speaker is Dr. Adam DeVille. He is the professor of theology at the University of St. Francis, and he's presented on many topics. He is Byzantine Catholic, so talking about iconoclasm is something of a specialty of his. So without further ado, I want to pass the microphone off to Adam DeVille. Thank you.
There we go. How's that? That's better. I'll have to remember I've got that on. You know, I'm struck coming in here tonight, only the second time of kind of the incongruity between the topic and the loveliness of this space. So for kind of a thought experiment as we get started, maybe imagine that we are the new parish council. We've kind of taken over, right? We've launched a kind of an aggressive takeover bid to this parish. And one way we're going to assert our presence and our power here is by taking all the art out. We're going to say, no, we want to prove that we're in charge here now, and so we're going to start systematically, one by one, removing the Stations of the Cross, dismantling statues, and if we can't dismantle them, then we'll paint over them, or we'll hang banners in front of them, or we'll somehow obscure them. Why would we do that? That's one of the questions that I want to ask tonight. What does it mean to either remove art or to put new art in? And part of what I'm going to suggest is that the answer to that question, to both of those questions, is the same thing. Every culture, every tradition experiences some conflict over art. Ancient and modern cultures, Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, Islamic, Jewish cultures. All of these go through periods when we erupt into some kind of conflict over art. It might be brief, or it might be more sustained. Informally, it seems to me that over the last 15 years or so, we've been seeing more protests directed at various forms of art. I mean, I think we're all old enough in here, if you cast your minds back to 2006 and the global protests that erupted over the Danish newspaper cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad. I mean, there were massive protests, violent protests in the streets of Copenhagen and Paris and London and elsewhere. More recently, including in this country and just this summer, we've seen protests erupt over art in North America and in Western Europe. And we've seen some of those protests actually topple various forms of public art, various forms of statues. Typically, what we've seen so far have been statues associated with the American Civil War or with slavery in this country. In Europe and in the United Kingdom, we've seen the toppling of statues of figures associated with imperial conquest. So Cecil Rhodes, for example, in England, or King Leopold II of the Belgians. Some attacks on statues of Christopher Columbus on both sides of the Atlantic. We've seen some buildings renamed in this country just in the past few months. After views associated or attached to people like Woodrow Wilson and Flannery O'Connor became manifest this summer, and people felt like these are no longer people after whom we want to name these buildings. So let's strip them off the buildings, right? We didn't take the building down, we just took their name down. But I think the impulse is the same. There's been a proposal, apparently, to rename a number of U.S. military bases. Now that's been blocked under the Trump administration, but whether that changes in the new year remains to be seen. Again, the impulse is, if these are named after Civil War generals, particularly from the South, then we feel we don't want to keep their names on there. Some people do. Even Catholic figures, if you've seen some of the headlines out of California, certain Catholic churches have had attacks made on some of their statues, including one of the newest saints here canonized by Pope Francis, Junipero Serra, whose image was toppled in some places, apparently because of his views on Native Americans. If we know a bit of history, we know that none of this is new. None of this is new. Outrage over images, attacks upon images, is not a recent phenomenon. It's always been with us, I think, in every culture that produces art, and for many reasons. Now, what I did find interesting this summer as we're watching these statues come down and people debate about it and so on, is that one phrase often got used, and that was to refer to these movements, these protests, these attacks as iconoclasm, as outbreaks of iconoclasm. That's a fairly ancient term, and it's a term that comes straight out of Eastern Christianity. So let's talk a little bit about that term and its history, and then see whether it applies to some of these movements today or not. So roughly 1,400 years ago, in the East Roman Empire, which for about the last 200 years we've often referred to as the Byzantine Empire, is where we find the origins of Christian iconoclasm. And Christians really, 7th, 8th, 9th centuries, had a very protracted period of fighting over whether we could have churches like this. Is it appropriate to have images of angels and saints? Is it appropriate to have images of Christ and the Mother of God? Or should we, as inheritors of the Jewish tradition, not follow the ancient commandments which say no graven images, right? Do we, by putting up these kinds of images, run the risk of that very grave biblical sin called idolatry? And there were good arguments on both sides, and a lot of Christians felt like, no, if we have all of this art, it's going to distract us from God. Perhaps people not being sufficiently educated might start to be worshiping the images rather than worshiping God. So this is a risk. We need to get rid of these. And there was a period where Christians went around and took images out of churches, whitewashed them if they couldn't get them off the walls, if they were, mosaics that were mounted, for example, or gouged the eyes out sometimes. Christians did this to their own churches. And that comes to be called iconoclasm. The word literally in Greek means icon smasher. So what would often happen is you'd pry something off the wall and then you'd take it up the top of the hill and throw it down over the cliff and watch it shatter on the rocks below. And that happened, as I say, in the eastern half of the Roman Empire, particularly in the 8th and 9th centuries. Christians gathered in Nicaea in 787 in an ecumenical council to deal with this problem. That's how big a problem it was. It took a council, an ecumenical council, to try and deal with this problem. And the council said, we're aware of the risks that images might pose for some people, but we believe it's legitimate to have churches with images like this, right? Whether they're 3D statues, whether they're 2D in more typical traditional style icons, whether there's a bas-relief like this in the altarpiece, whatever it is, we believe it's legitimate to have these kinds of images. That impulse didn't go away. And so the other term that I think is actually a better term to use, ikonomachy, which in Greek means icon struggle. So we have a struggle over images. Settles down by the 9th century, crops up again in the 16th century in Western Europe. And there's a very good case to be made that much of the Reformation, particularly in places like Switzerland, Scotland, and England for that matter, is an outbreak of iconoclasm, right? We see a lot of the destruction of Christian art at that point. But as I said a moment ago, this is not a uniquely Christian phenomenon. Very deliberately and systematically destroy art from the end of the First World War through the Weimar Republic, in part because they see it as art of national humiliation. We lost the war. The republic that grew out of the German Empire after 1918 is the republic of losers. We are here, that is, we as the Nazis are here now to proclaim the rise of the Third Reich, which of course, let us remember, was supposed to last for 1,000 glorious years. And so if we are now this new administration that is building this glorious empire for 1,000 years, we need art suitable to our purposes. In the same period, the same fight, for many of the same reasons, happens in the Soviet Union. The Bolsheviks, after the revolution in 1917, went about smashing art associated with the Romanov dynasty on the one hand and the Orthodox Church on the other, and the two were very tightly bound up with one another. Why do we smash imperial palaces in Russia? I mean, magnificent buildings. Why would we attack those stunning churches of the Orthodox tradition? Why would we burn these to the ground, bulldoze them? Why would we do all of this? The answer in Germany and in Soviet Russia is, I think, the same answer we would give if we looked at the art after the French Revolution or the art after the American Revolution, when images of the king become replaced by images of, for example, Uncle Sam. So why do we do this? What's going on? Well, I think every time we see these conflicts over images erupt, what we're looking at is the dying of one political order and the rise of another. That's why I started off my little anecdote here, right? If we've just launched our coup here, and we're the new self-appointed parish council, part of the way we prove our power is by changing the art. That's something that's happened time and time again throughout history. So I think we can say, and one of the books in your handout makes a very good job of arguing this at some length. That's James Noyes' book from 2013, The Politics of Iconoclasm. He argues in that book, every outbreak of the smashing of art is always the prelude to a new political arrangement, right? New people in charge, new bosses in town, and they show they're in charge in part by getting rid of the visible emblems of the, the ancien regime, right? The old regime. We get rid of that stuff. But I think if we're honest, if we reflect on our own lives a little bit, we realize we do this ourselves in our own daily lives. I mean, just to give you a very banal example as I'm driving in here, perhaps some of you had lawn signs up of your favorite candidates during the recent election campaigns. And perhaps if your candidate lost, you made sure to hurry out the next day and get rid of that sign. Perhaps if your candidate won, you may still have that sign up, right? You want to sort of show off to your neighbors that you picked the winning side. Let's say last weekend, very windy, at least in Fort Wayne, kind of rainy, kind of cold. Maybe you stayed inside. Maybe you were going through your basement or your closet or your attic. Found an old box of photo albums. And maybe as you're flipping through those, you forgot all about those pictures, you're flipping through them, and you come across some images of a particularly hated ex-boyfriend or ex-girlfriend, or somebody else that you didn't want to be reminded of. People will sometimes take those images and do what? Burn them, right? Throw them in the fireplace. Get rid of them. Put them through the shredder. Put them out in the recycling. Or you had a poster in your room growing up, your favorite movie star, favorite football player. And then something about their life kind of comes up in the media. And you realize they've done some pretty horrifying things. Take the poster down, right? Destroy the poster. That's a fairly common action. What are we doing? Well, we're rethinking the role of these people in our life and the potential authority they may have had over us at one point. And we're making a political judgment. What do I mean by that? You think, well, it's just an old girlfriend. I threw out her picture, right? It's an old, poster of some NFL player. Who cares? It's not politics, right? What am I doing? But politics as Aristotle said, is simply asking the question, how should we order our life together? How do you order your individual life with its history and its memories and its art? How do you order the life of your family? How do you order the life of your parish, of your community, of your city, of your country, of your empire? Part of the ordering of our lives is the ordering of the art that reminds us of the past we now don't want to be a part of, and a future that we might want to create. Politics, then, is always bound up with the destruction of art, right? It's a political act. How do I order my life? And part of my argument, and some of the others that I've mentioned, is that that is as true for Christians in the Roman Empire in the 8th and 9th centuries as it is Germans in the 1920s and Russians in the 1930s and Americans in 2020, as we're having these discussions about what do we do with forms of art erected, for example, after the Civil War. Do we leave them up or do we take them down? I think there's some serious questions here, and part of what I want to move on to is to suggest that the answers to them is not entirely clear, but Catholics have an advantage of some reflection on this question from the church that's not well known. So as we shift our judgment about history, about figures from the past, and about art, we're engaging in a kind of revisionism. And I think that word sometimes has a bad reputation among some people, so I want to just reflect for a moment on the nature of human memory and on the process of writing history, because I don't think that's well understood. Human history, like human memory, is regularly being revised for many reasons, and we're not always aware of that. So, for example, why would we have multiple histories written of a particular period? Think, well, isn't it all set and done? Aren't the facts kind of cemented in place? Why would we bother having a new history in 2020 of, say, the American Civil War? Why? What does that contribute? Well, the writing of history changes for a number of reasons. For example, new sources might become available, right? It's often the case that historians, when they're writing, don't have access to all the documents they want because they're embargoed or they're placed under restricted conditions. So, for example, if I'm a fairly well-known person, but I also have some skeletons in my closet, I might say to historians, you can have access to my papers after I'm dead, but you've got to wait 50 years, right? You've got to wait 100 years. Because I want to make sure that everybody who could be embarrassed by what's in those papers is themselves dead. So you might get new sources, but it might be many, many decades or centuries even after the person has died. An example I'm familiar with. Many of the Freud papers were left to the Library of Congress, but there are a couple of letters in there that Freud wrote that are not allowed to be opened under the terms of the bequest until the end of this century, I think it is. I forget the exact date, but it's well into the 21st century. I mean, Freud's been dead for 81 years at this point, right? His children are all dead. One of his famous grandsons just died. What's in that letter? So new sources become available. Sometimes they've been deliberately held back for many decades. Or you might have new access to sources that you couldn't previously access. You didn't have the language, for example. You had to train to be able to read some of these documents. Big example of this are all of the documents in the various archives of the Ottoman Empire. Because the Ottoman Empire, as it's giving way to the modern country of Turkey, made a deliberate decision in the 1920s to move towards a Latin alphabet, away from Arabic. And as a result of that change, most people in Turkey today cannot read their own historical documents. You've got to get specialized training in earlier versions of Turkish that used Arabic script. New methods become available. I watched a fascinating video just yesterday, I think it was. A couple of PhD students, forget where they're at, but they're using some very high-tech equipment to examine ancient manuscripts and even ancient, examples here, ancient tapestries. Because oftentimes what you've got are multiple layers into a manuscript or even into a tapestry or a painting. Sometimes you have people paint over top of things. And some of the photographic techniques they're using now, some of the equipment they're using, allows them to be able to see down beneath the surface layer in ways that they couldn't see before. So new methods might come along causing you to rethink old sources that you previously could not have full access to. And then human perspective shifts, right? Human perspective shifts. The perspective immediately after a war, on the war, is going to be very different from the perspective of a generation or 2 or 5 or 10 down the road. We don't, in 2020, for example, think of the First World War in the way that people who fought and survived it did when it came to the writing of that war in the 1920s and the 1930s. And so we have a different perspective on that. And we're going to look at events in that war differently than the people who lived through it. And that's all quite legitimate, right? There's nothing wrong with people doing that. So history gets revised, human memory gets revised. And I think that's often the way it should be. Now, sometimes I'm going to suggest here, it's not just that history does get revised, but that it should be. It should be in some, perhaps, very careful, deliberate ways. And the example I have in mind here are memories that impede the progress of reconciliation among people. The late Pope John Paul II had a phrase for this, which he used many, many times over 25 years, and I've written about this elsewhere. He talks about the healing of memories, or the purification of memories. And he was very conscious that memories of past conflict oftentimes prevent Christians from being reconciled today. I'll give you an example. I have a book coming out early in the new year on conflict between Catholics and Orthodox Christians in Ukraine in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. And part of the problem in writing that book is that we simply don't agree on how to describe the same events. For some, particularly on the Orthodox side, these were wonderful events. For many Catholics, these were events of sorrow and persecution. We don't have a common narrative there. Part of what I think Pope John Paul was suggesting was we need to find a way to heal those memories, because that impedes Christians from drawing closer to one another. So healing of memories becomes really important. Now, what does that look like? What does that entail in some practical details? Well, let me answer that question by putting it in the context of the following question. Should Catholics support or oppose the removal of statues of Robert E. Lee, or Christopher Columbus, Thomas Jefferson, King Leopold II of the Belgians, or others you want to mention? Should we oppose that, or should we support it? I think there are some pretty good arguments on both sides. Should we have a Catholic position at all, right? I'm not going to tell you that there is a Catholic position here on this question. I want to sketch out 3 possibilities, 3 possible ways we could think about that question. The first, which I saw in some articles this summer as we were debating about these statues, is a very literal conservatism, right? Conservatism, by definition, means I want to conserve something, I want to hang on to it, right? So let's say, God forbid, this parish, is no longer able to sustain this beautiful building. And there's a proposal that comes through town, well, let's buy it and turn it into condos, right? That seems to be the answer to a lot of empty churches today. We turn it into condominiums. But there's a local conservation society that comes through and says, no, look at all this wonderful art here. You're going to just take this all out and, build condos in here? We want to conserve that. The Catholic Church, and Christianity more generally, is often a very conservative institution. It likes to hang on to art and history and the past, right? We talk about the importance of tradition, what is handed down from generation to generation. So some Catholics this summer, as we're seeing these debates over these statues, said, given that the church has opposed iconoclasts in the past, opposed people destroying art, we today should adopt the same approach. We have the same instinct, and we think you should not take down statues, whether it's of a slave owner, an imperial conqueror, a southern general in the Civil War, whoever it is, just leave them alone, right? We don't think taking art down of any form is a good idea. I think that's one possible Catholic position, right? I don't think there's arguments in favor of that. Now, on the other side, you can say, well, as a Catholic, I think these people were racists, slave owners, responsible for the massacre of millions of people in some cases. They were clearly not good people. Take the statues down, right? If we're going to be reconciled with the people who suffered at the hands of these various people, if we're going to be peacemakers as Christ calls us to be, and if these statues are impeding peace and reconciliation, get rid of them. And I think that's also a possible position that Catholics could adopt. Many of us, perhaps most of us, are probably in the somewhat ambivalent middle, right? I think, well, I could see some arguments against, I can see some arguments in favor. I'm not totally sure how I feel about this. Iconoclasm is often a dramatic rupture, and it can upset a lot of people. So I don't know if I want to go and say, well, let's get rid of the statues. I don't particularly want to defend the person necessarily, but I don't know that I like the idea of taking down these statues. So I want to draw on a document that was published by Rome in 1999 that has gotten very little attention. It's called Memory and Reconciliation, the Church and the Faults of the Past. It's a document that came out from the International Theological Commission under the direction of then Cardinal Ratzinger, as he was, prepared for the Great Jubilee of 2000 under papal direction. It's a long document, it's a dense document. I would certainly encourage you to find it on the Vatican website. I would encourage you, if you're interested, to read it. But let me just pull out a couple of excerpts that might be relevant here for us. So looking at these conflicts historically, where we don't agree on how to assess people from the past and how to assess events from the past, the document says one of the things we need to do is what it calls eliminate from personal and collective consciousness all forms of resentment or violence left by the inheritance of the past. So if we are carrying around a grudge and the statue or the image reminds us of that, you put up a statue of that person that persecuted my family or my tribe, right, or my church or whatever it is. That guy is responsible for invading my country, right, and killing my very ancient relatives. If you're still carrying that around with you, the document says you need, as a Christian, to find ways of letting that go, right? Letting go the resentment and the violence from the inheritance of the past. I think if we're going to keep this in the context of Americans this summer, there's a legitimate question there to say, have we done that? Have we in this country tried to get rid of our resentment at the violence of the Civil War and of the slave trade? Or is that memory, for some people anyway, still a source of real pain and trauma? How have we dealt with that memory? Have we dealt with that memory? The document says you've got to do that first. And if you can get yourself into a position where you don't have that burning resentment and anger, in other words, you become calm and peaceful about it, you become sort of dispassionate, as the fathers of the church, the fathers of the desert would certainly say, right? You move beyond passion and anger and so on. You become very sort of serene. If we can get to that point, the document says, then we have the possibility of a new assessment of history, in which memory of division and opposition is purified and substituted by a reconciled memory. What does that mean? We overcome the resentment of the past, maybe we can come to a new memory, a new narrative, if you will, a reconciled memory. So, go back to the example of the book that I mentioned. The book arose out of a conference I was at the University of Vienna in June of 2016. And we deliberately brought Russian Orthodox Christians and Ukrainian Catholic Christians together in one room and locked the doors and said, let's talk about what happened in 1946 in Ukraine. Can we come up with a common narrative in which we achieve a certain reconciled memory? And the answer was we couldn't. People were not ready for that yet. It's not an easy process, right? It's not an easy process. We grow up, we bring our own children up, we've been brought up ourselves to believe certain things about the past and certain people from the past. And if we're asked to reconcile with those people today, that still poses obstacles and roadblocks for some of us. There's another question here, though. Substituted by a reconciled memory. What is that? How can you substitute a reconciled memory? Right? Isn't that kind of deliberately rewriting the past? And in some ways, yes, it is. And I want to argue that Christians have no problem doing that because we do it every Sunday. We do it at every liturgy. Right? To substitute a reconciled memory calls to mind the biblical term here, which is anamnesis, which is an interesting term in Greek. It shows up in the institution narratives in the Gospels. Jesus gives a future command. In the present, gives a future command to his followers. Do this in memory of me. It hasn't happened yet, and yet he's telling you in the future to do it, and that will put you in memory of me. That's, I think, what this document is getting at, right? We're substituting a reconciled memory, because that's exactly what the Eucharist does. The Eucharist takes what I think we have to be aware of as a scene of massive trauma, right? You've got an innocent man who is arrested under false pretenses, who is tortured within an inch of his life, and then he's executed. An innocent man. That is what we commemorate every Sunday, right? The death of Christ. And yet we don't end with that, right? We don't receive the body of a corpse. We receive the living Christ. Because the memory of that trauma has been transformed by the glory of the resurrection. So we substitute the resurrectional memory and experience for the past trauma done of Christ, quite literally. So that's what we talk about as this notion of anamnesis, right? This memory in the future of something in the past that changes both past and future. So let's bring that back to one of the examples I've highlighted here, the American Civil War. What do we do with people who say we want to take down statues of, Civil War leaders or others associated with the American experience of slavery? Do we get rid of those statues or not? I'm going to suggest that of the options, that one makes the most sense. Taking those down allows us to think about finding those reconciled memories that the church calls us to. I'm going to throw in another set of arguments here and say that sometimes remembering is not a good thing. Sometimes we remember too much. And that runs counter to most of our experience, I think, because we're often called out at work, maybe got written up, or at school, you were tardy, you arrived after the bell rang. Or we reproach ourselves. Oh, I can't believe I forgot that dentist appointment this morning, right? Or you go, I know I do this all the time, you go to the grocery store and you think, okay, only 3 things I need to get. As soon as you walk in the store, 2 of them just vanish from your memory. You're like, why do I forget this stuff? I should have written it down, right? So we think that forgetting is bad and remembering is good. But I want to suggest that in certain cases, not all, this is not a blanket statement, but in certain cases of historical conflict, it might be best, it might open a way for us if we engaged in some deliberate forgetting. Again, we've been brought up to believe that forgetting is bad, right? And if you've taken a history course or two, you've probably heard the famous slogan that those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it. But I'm not sure that that's entirely true, right? Sometimes we remember the past, we do remember it, and we repeat it, right? Just because we remember some horrible action is in itself no guarantee at all that it's not going to happen again. Forgetting does not necessarily guarantee repetition. Remembering does not necessarily guarantee that we avoid something. I mean, just think how many of us have made a trip to the confessional at the back, right? Week by week or month by month or however you go. And do not all of us, from time to time, become very regular in taking the same sins with us into confession, right? I might remember them and say, yes, in my act of contrition, I'm not going to commit these again, right? And we commit them again. So remembering something is no guarantee that the past is going to be changed. And forgetting sometimes might open up the way towards a different future. In fact, there's been an explosion in memory studies over the last 30 years. And one of the things that's become really obvious, and we're talking about human memory, is that we forget way more than we remember. And we need to forget in order for memory to be able to function. If we tried to remember every single thing, the system would simply be overwhelmed. And so we don't remember a lot, and that's actually a good thing. This has led a number of scholars, some of whom I put in the bibliography, Bradford Vivian, David Reich, and Manuel Cruz among them, over the last 5 years to publish a number of provocative books on the value and the virtue of forgetting. And they've argued that in some cases of historical trauma and violent conflict, of which I would say that slavery is the worst example in this country, sometimes a deliberate forgetting may well be the only way to move forward to any kind of reconciled memory and genuine healing. And if that's true, then removing statues of people associated with the Civil War, associated with the slave trade, might actually allow us to move forward. If we deliberately say we are no longer going to commemorate these people, we're going to remove these artistic emblems of them, does that open the way towards a different future? I don't know. There are no guarantees, and I'm not prescribing a panacea here, but it does seem to me that it's a possible question we might need to think about. And so the Spanish philosopher Manuel Cruz has a very interesting book from 2016 on the difficulty of living together, memory, politics, and history. And in there he says, deliberate forgetting is what he says is a way of draining history, draining it of its power, particularly painful and traumatic history that might hold us in its thrall even today. And so if we remove some of the reminders of these conflicts from the past, we might drain the past of its powerful hold over us. In the same way, if you've had that experience of breaking up in a relationship, taking the letters, the pictures, the reminders of that relationship and destroying them for some people is often very therapeutically so. To do that is to break free of the power of that relationship. Is that something we could do as a culture? I don't know. I don't know if that's possible or not, but it does seem to me it's one possible way we might want to think about. If we take down emblems of people who caused division, caused war, caused people to suffer, and stopped talking about them, and let them just kind of disappear into the footnotes of future history books, have we lost anything? Have we lost any valuable memories, or have we opened up the possibility of that new reconciled memory of a better future that the church calls us to? And so in the end, I would say, if you ask me about the question of statues, what would Catholics think about that? I would say it's not iconoclasm necessarily. I think it is possibly that form of anamnesis that I mentioned, right? That reconfiguration of the past that opens the way towards healing and reconciliation in the present. And that reconciliation comes to us offered by Christ, who does this with us every week. We take the memory of his suffering and death, and it's transformed by God into the glory of his resurrection and into that kingdom which he inaugurates, where, as St. Paul says, there is neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for all are one in Christ Jesus. Such a reconciled future is one to which the Lord beckons all of us, even now. Thank you.
So now we just want to open it up. If anybody has any questions,
Yep.
if you're online or here in the church, feel free to raise your hand if you have a question. If you're in the church, if you're online, type it in the comments, and I'll make sure to read it out loud. So, any questions?
Okay, well, that's all I can ask, you know. That's all that you can ever hope for, you know. Yeah, please.
I loved your talk.
Thank
Could we have a copy?
Yeah, absolutely. I can leave the text here, and you know, Drew can make photocopies, or I can email a text to somebody or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, great. It'd be wonderful because you cover a lot of material. So, thank you.
Okay.
If you do want a copy of it and you regularly attend Mass here, either weekday or weekends, I'll make sure that I put, if you send me copies, Adam, I can make some copies and put it downstairs in the by Gallner Hall, or if you're really interested in a talk and want me to email it to you, feel free to contact me. My email's in the bulletin, and I'll send you a copy. Thank you. Any other questions or thoughts?
I should say, just on a related note, if you know, maybe kids in your own family or neighbors or whatever, if you know any high school students who are interested in Christian art, God willing, and the pandemic receding, next summer we're having the camp that we've run at the University of St. Francis now for 4 or 5 years. Drew was the first director back in, what was that, 2017? I think we got the first one, 2017, that's right. Week-long experience. I can get you more details if you want, but it brings kids from across the country to learn how to do Christian-style icons of Christ and of the Mother of God, and they love it. We get kids coming from across the country, and so if you have kids in your own family or people you know that you might want to recommend this to, I can put you in touch with that material, because they have a chance to immerse themselves in the history of Christian art, the theology of art, and then actually paint an icon themselves. And it's proved to be a very, very rich experience for kids.
Yeah, so I highly recommend that theology camp. The first year we had it, it was great. It was smaller that first year, but the kids really enjoyed themselves. And it's a really great experience when you're learning about how beauty is more important than just something in the eye of the beholder. And it's a very beautiful thing to see the kids paint the icons. It's a great process.
Yeah.
Really amazing process. Yeah. Highly recommend that. If you're interested in that, I will be posting information about that. If it's still going on, I'll post it closer to the time. I'll post information on how to register and everything on our parish Facebook page. And always feel free to reach out to Adam at St. Francis, too. I'm sure they'll tell you more.
Yeah.
Well, Adam, thank you very much. This was amazing.
Thank you for the invite.
So I want to thank Dr. DeVille for coming down tonight. And we hope to have him back again maybe in the spring, depending on COVID, to talk maybe about a little more about the Catholic view or the historiography and the Catholic view, because it's something I think right now is very important. So we hope to have Adam back soon. So thank you very much, Adam. Let's
You're
give him
welcome.
a round of applause.
All right, thank you. You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, so we will see everyone again at Mass. And if you want to watch this video, it will be up and available after the presentation. If it's on Facebook, it'll probably be a couple hours before you'll be able to see it. But on YouTube, it should be available at the link that we posted online at any point. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a good evening. Thank you.